Welcome to another program of Tzuzamen. Hi, Tzipi.
Hi, Tzili. And we
Hi,
are
Thank you.
here.
Ido.
Hi, Ido, which will tell
Hello.
is in a minute. But before we have to tell them that this is Tzuzamen together. And we are here to open ourselves to new ideas. And Ido is really a perfect guest to really take us somewhere else, an important somewhere else. So can you please introduce Ido?
Ido Aharoni. Ido was the Consul General of Israel in New York till a few years ago. Now a professor, political science at NYU, the head of the chairman of the Charney Forum of New Diplomacy in the University of Haifa, and many more things. Hi, Ido, how are you?
Very good.
Ah,
Just
Good to
landed
be
from
with you.
Israel.
Yes, I just landed from Israel.
How did they let you go?
Well, I had to prove that I am needed here, and NYU declared that I'm needed, and that's it.
oh, you should ask us. We will say it.
We would give you a note that we need you.
Of course, of course. So Tzili knows you for a long time and knows everything about you.
Almost.
Almost right. It's good that everybody will have some
Yeah.
secrets, like you, me. So I think that what's really for me, it's important to know how do you brand a country?
We just want to say that Ido was the one who came up with the idea to rebrand Israel and change the attitude towards Israel. But I think, Ido, it's maybe what's more, what I wanted to talk about before the rebranding is basically because we spoke about it a lot, how the Israelis see Israel from their point of view, how the Americans or the world see Israel from here. What do we need to change? And of course, this leads to rebranding, because I have to say that when Ido was a consul general in New York, he took a totally different approach from the others, and he was trying to find ways, not the regular way that everybody was beating up on the same equation and the Torah, the Bible that Israel was trying to talk about all the time. And he was trying to look for different angles, different point of views, show the good things about Israel,
Well,
and try to create a different attitude towards Israel. So you can pick where you want to start with this, because there's plenty that I think the Israelis and the people outside of Israel need to know.
Well, thank you for your very, very kind introduction. So I came to this issue as a diplomat with training as a social anthropologist and sociologist, and I also studied filmmaking, which
Yay.
didn't make me your typical foreign service officer. Most of them were either from intelligence background or Middle Eastern study. For sure, 99% of my colleagues were analysts. I'm not an analyst. I came with a marketing mindset. So that's how I came to this issue, looking at, in sociology, you're trying to predict people's behavior. That's what you're trying to do. And I said, there's something wrong about the way Israel is communicating itself to the world, because when I learned about marketing, they told me that the most important thing in marketing is identify your own competitive advantage. And what is it that Israel is communicating to the world? When Israel is given the opportunity, and over the years, Israel received an extremely generous platform to express its positions from even before statehood. It probably changed a little bit in recent years with the rise of the climate change as the main issue and other issues. So, and we can talk about how that happened. Had a lot to do with the mistakes the Palestinians made. But what I discovered, this was almost 20 years ago, is that Israel is trying to defy the very basic rules of marketing. We're trying to improve the performance of our country by constantly communicating its problems. Imagine that you will try to promote a product by constantly highlighting its deficiencies and weaknesses. It didn't make any sense. And then what we needed was to back this with research, and we put together a wonderful group of people called the Brand Israel Group of volunteers, all experts in branding and strategy and market research. And we were able to prove beyond any doubt that the story of Israel's problems is a turnoff, and that Daniel Kahneman was right. People can live perfectly fine with the disconnect between the rational and the emotional. Most decisions are being made in the emotional domain, and we're unable to reach out to that domain because we are constantly preoccupied with the task of explaining. That's where the word hasbara comes from, facts and legal arguments and all this. Now, I'm not belittling the importance of facts and legal arguments. They're important only if this is what you care about. But if this is not what you care about, let's say if you're studying film with Professor Trope at NYU and you care about movies, then why not communicate Israel's advantages and Israel's assets in the area of filmmaking? And of course, we know that the hottest conversation today in the world is the conversation around lifestyle, the culinary experience, design, art. Where's Israel in this whole conversation? So, what we did, we started implementing this idea. We did it humbly because we had no budget. And then I realized that the only way for me to really have an impact is not by expecting the Foreign Service to finance all my ideas. I realized very, very quickly that I can't expect anything from a budgetary point of view. So what we did, we partnered by with other organizations, and so I found myself in a position of becoming a salesperson for an idea, which, if you think about it, is the true meaning of diplomacy. Diplomacy from the from its very inception was accepted with a great deal of suspicion. Even during the Renaissance, there was a claim that the new that there was a claim that, or an expectation for diplomacy without diplomats. Diplomats were viewed as people with privilege, people that used the multiplicity of language, and they were duplicitous. You can still find that sentiment in many places in the world, especially in the United States under Donald Trump. The despise, the contempt to American civil servants reflected those sentiments. He didn't trust them. He accused them of deep state and fake news and all those things. He did not invent any of that. This existed as part of politics and diplomacy for hundreds of years. The new form of diplomacy is all about the ability to communicate values, to find the common ground, and to work on collaboration rather than victory.
But I want to
Uh,
stop you here for a second, Ido,
sure.
because we're talking about um, to change the attitude towards another place and to create a common ground. As we know, the attitude in Israel is not there. And Israel somewhere got stuck many years ago. And it's the third generation that is growing up on the same rules.
Right. So,
And
yeah,
the
yeah,
idea is basically to rehabilitate the 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 way of thinking of Israelis about themselves in Israel, and to rehabilitate their attitude towards the Jews outside of Israel. And
yeah.
then you can basically collaborate.
Right.
And
So this is
such a
another,
big dissonance.
yeah, this is another big change of diplomacy. If in the past diplomats were programmed and trained and designed to work externally, then now we know that because of the internet is eliminating the importance of national boundaries, that diplomats have to work domestically as well.
Mhm.
So a big part of my work on Brand Israel actually took place in Israel. For 3 years between 2007 to 2010, I conducted hundreds, if not more, of exposure events. I remember people still tell me, people see me until this very day, say, we remember you walking around with that little black, you know, that little suitcase with the computer and the speakers, and I had the screen projector in there, and I was ready. You would wake me up in the middle of the night, and I would give you an hour and a half of why it's important to look at Israel as a brand and why it's important to celebrate Israel's creative spirit and so on and so forth. Everything was backed by research, and absolutely. So you're absolutely correct. Israel is a very unique case. What happened to Israel? Zionism started in many ways. You know, every nation has its own national ethos. The national ethos, in many ways, is the oil that helps the wheels go. In the case of the United States, the national ethos is called the American dream, the belief that if you're willing to work hard, the sky's the limit. In Israel's case, the national ethos at first, when Zionism was established, when you look at the pioneers that came in the second Aliyah, and even the people that followed them, the group of Ben Gurion and Golda and all those people, they had a very, very compelling narrative. Their narrative was, we are going to build something new. It was about renewal. It was about inclusion. Um, it was about, and I know it sounds today, a bit outdated to talk about inclusion in the context of those days. But if you think about women and their role in the revolution, Zionism was a revolution. It was a big part of inclusive. There was a big inclusive element in there, although it wasn't perfect. Certainly wasn't perfect, but much better than other revolutions. If you look at other revolutions that took place in the 19th century, 20th century. And so something happened in 1945 that changed the course of the evolution of Israel's national ethos from a positive, forward looking, progressive national ethos. 1945 was the turning point. Our national ethos became fixated on the past. What happened in 1945? Two things happened. First is the Holocaust ended, the war ended with the liberation of Europe, and it took time for the people in Palestine to fully understand what happened. It wasn't like today where you can simply, open your smartphone and read everything about it. It took months. I remember asking my dad about it, and he said, we did not know. There were lots of rumors, a lot of misinformation, and you didn't know whether to believe those rumors or not. And until the eyewitnesses started coming in, and the British, the Americans, and the Russian troops documented with pictures, and until those pictures started to come out, it was very difficult to convince people that it really, actually, indeed happened, that there was a systemic effort to extinct the entire Jewish people. And the second thing that happened, same year, astonishingly, the Arabs decide to suffocate the tiny economy in the land of Israel of 500,000 people with almost no industry, very little agriculture, zero export. And they enact the Arab economic boycott, which plays into the hands of the powers of the Cold War and basically forces Israel to engage in two parallel narratives. In one narrative is never again. That became the national ethos of Israel until this very day. Now, never again, while understandable, is also very paralyzing because if the task of the state of Israel, security establishment, is to prevent the second Holocaust, then the question comes, is there a limit to the amount of resources I'm willing to invest in preventing a second Holocaust? And the answer, of course, is not. There's no limit. And so we became a nation that is highly militaristic, that not only the language, the entire mindset, even when we talk about diplomacy, in Israel, people really believe that diplomacy is the continuation of war by other means, which is, of course, baloney.
So the
But
diplomacy was using like, it was all the time like punching bags.
Exactly. Diplomacy, and again, it did not start today. The United Nations is a perfect example, an organization that is certainly not as nearly as important as it used to be. Yet in Israel, we still attach a great deal of importance to this organization, which is largely dysfunctional
Yes.
and
Now
inept.
everybody knows it.
And for us, it's the source of our legitimacy. And what did we do in the United Nations? If you think about, you remember Chaim Herzog tearing
Yes.
apart.
Yeah.
This was
A
a
constant
debate.
battle.
It was a battleground for endless
Yes.
debate. And what
But
our
I think,
research showed,
Ido, I think it goes together with the attitude that we were born to into, that we are miserable and weak and poor and we
Victims.
need help,
right,
and oi 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 every morning, oi oi oi.
right,
At the same time, the strongest, the largest enemy army among our enemies, and we have the smartest people, uh, the most creative people. There was no balance,
right.
and basically we are dependent on the money of the diaspora people. And if we
No,
see the older
yeah,
generation in the United States, they just kept pouring people money on Israel, just to save Israel all the time. And today, the picture outside of Israel is very different, very, very
right.
different. And in Israel, something never changed.
Yeah. Well, things did change. What happened is, so as I said, the national narrative became never again. And unlike the American dream, which is forward looking, never again is obsessed with the past.
Backwards.
And so we became a nation that is preoccupied with its past, is proudly looking at the past, and does very little to plan strategically for the future. And I
Right.
can give you many, many examples. So it's not about money. You know, Peter Drucker once said that
Who is he?
Peter Drucker is a big guru of management, and Tzili knows his grandson, Nova Spivak is his grandson. And he once said very wisely, he said, culture will eat strategy for breakfast. So you can plan all sorts of plans. At the end of the day, it's the culture of the people that will determine pretty much what Daniel Kahneman is saying. That people's emotional response, they can't even rationalize why they make the decision that they make, and so on. The thing in Israel is this: Zionism, Judaism was always torn between the two extremes. On the one hand, you have the universalist contribution of Judaism to the world, the universal values. Those were the values that the founders of the Zionist movement aspired to promote. And then you always had the particularistic end of the spectrum, which was very Jewish, very conservative, very orthodox, not inclusive at all. And what you see now, because of the fact that Israel was unable in 1948 to introduce a separation between state and synagogue, what you're seeing now is the same historical process that brought down Jewish independence twice before in our history. The Jewish ethnocentric forces that push for particularism are basically prevailing within Israel. And those who present universal ideas are being sidelined very aggressively.
Yes.
And this is the big change that happened in Israeli society. It happened with the openness to mass media in the early 1980s, in the mid 1970s. Menachem Begin was the first prime minister who did two things that contributed greatly to this. The first thing that he did, he brought in the ultra orthodox into the coalition. The coalition, the ultra orthodox never had any operational portfolios. Menachem Begin was the first to give them operational portfolios. If you remember, Rabbi Shapira and all those folks. The second thing that he did, he turned the Holocaust, just like he did with racial tensions in Israel. He turned the Holocaust into a political currency,
Yeah. It's a tool.
and it became some sort of a platform. And again, when people ask me if we ever experienced something similar to the events of January 6th in
In
Washington
the
D.C.,
capital.
I remind them how Menachem Begin, as the politician, urged Israelis to storm the Knesset
I
around
don't remember it.
the reparations with Germany in the 1950s. But in
Oh,
any
yeah.
event, so Menachem Begin did a couple of great things. And no question, especially when you compare him to leaders today. He was a decent human being, an honest human being, was not corrupt. But he also left us a couple of very questionable gifts. And one of them is the role of the Holocaust in present life. I much prefer the view of Ben Gurion on the Holocaust, who said, you know, we must never allow the Holocaust to paralyze us,
Right.
Right.
and we have to look forward and be obsessed with the future and not obsessed with the past. And
And we can see
unfortunately,
today in the non-stop invasions of
right,
the Israeli youth and organization to Poland every year, which
yeah,
I think it's doing the wrong service.
But no, but I have a
absolutely is.
question. I have a question because on one hand, you when you started to change the narrative of them, you had almost to bypass the media because the media is not interested in positive things.
Right.
As long as
I
Israel was
right.
in the news in terms of conflict and clashes and missiles here and missiles there and
I
the
don't think
Hamas
the
and the,
media is interested in questioning or in viewing
no, but
ideas.
no, yeah, but
No,
the image of
there is a
Israel
way.
through the
There's a way
media
to.
kept
There's a way to engage the media, because at the end of the day, it's about the performance of the country. So it's about economics, and so the financial media was interested. But I made two decisions. Remember, I operated basically as a lone gunman. I had friends in Jerusalem, most notably Amir Gissin, my fellow colleague from Toronto, and a few other people that were very supportive. But by and large, most Israeli diplomats, certainly the senior diplomats, looked at me as a threat, tried to undermine my work. And the reason is because I took them out of the comfort zone. And they were trained to be the Middle
They didn't
Eastern
understand
analysts.
you, Ido. They didn't understand and they were helpless.
Yeah, I don't know if they were helpless. It's just that, you know,
no, maybe a different agenda.
I
Why
see it
helpless?
in organizations all the time. I now consult some of the biggest organizations in the world. And, you know, it's a natural thing, it's a human thing.
Yeah,
People resist change.
right.
Doesn't matter whether you're working at NYU or you're working at Citibank, people resist change. People don't like to be taken out of their comfort zone.
Hmm.
And it's a natural reaction. And the way to avoid it, it was to avoid media exposure for myself. That's the first thing. Secondly, I operated in a highly complex political environment. You have to understand, every time a new minister came in, I had to start from scratch. So the process started under Shimon Peres, then Silvan Shalom, then Tzipi Livni, then Avigdor Lieberman. And I'm missing someone. I'm
And
missing
Maybe.
someone. Yeah, and Bibi was the prime minister post 2009. But every time I had to resell the idea. Now I have to say that the decision makers were never the problem. It was the easiest thing or easier to convince a decision maker to look at Israel as a brand than to convince my colleagues. It's a very
that's
interesting
interesting.
lesson in organizational sociology. And I have to say that one of the reasons I left the foreign ministry is because I just had enough. I just said, you know what?
But Ido, maybe the decision makers were easy to convince, but none of them made sure to break this box and rebuild it in a different way.
No, it's a wonderful question because when you look at the cases of places that try to change the narrative, everywhere where the political leader claimed credit for it, it failed. So the key was not to let the political leadership to say, this is my project. The key was to let people, especially in the Jewish world, especially in the media, to feel that something is happening. I'm going to give the best example is the mayor of Tel Aviv, Ron Huldai, who instinctively understood that he has to do this without claiming credit. And that's why Tel Aviv is doing so well as a brand,
Right.
because he never stood up and said, "Oh, I'm branding Tel Aviv." By when you do that, you create what's called
You
consumer
brand yourself.
awareness.
Yeah.
So you create consumer awareness, and people will say, "Oh, wait a second, is this an experiment now? Am I taking part in an experiment?" And so the reason Tel Aviv is doing so well is that Ron Huldai was smart enough to let his professionals to get the job done. And you just interviewed one of them last week, my dear
Yeah.
friend Hila Oren, was phenomenal. Same thing happened here with Bloomberg. Bloomberg never stood in front of the cameras and said, "I'm rebranding New York as the new tech center of the East Coast." He just did it. He just created a new university, Cornell Tech, and just he just did it without making any promises.
Yeah, but you know what? People know the truth and not the truth. People don't know that there is another narrative of Israel being actually surrounded by like 10 of thousands of missiles, by Hezbollah, by Syria, by, so they
So here's
know.
the thing. Here's the thing. Um, Israel excelled in one thing. We turned the Israeli-Palestinian slash Israeli-Arab conflict into the most celebrated, talked about conflict in the world. And we did it with great talent. While, all that while, there were tens, not one and not two, there were tens of national, territorial,
Conflicts.
religious, ethnic conflicts around us that claimed way more lives than our conflicts.
Yeah.
Shall I mention India, Pakistan? Shall I mention the conflict within India between the Muslims and the rest of the nation? Shall I mention the Turks and the Kurds? Shall I mention the implosion of Iraq? Shall I mention the implosion of Libya? Shall I mention what just happened in Syria in the last 8 years? 500,000 people died, which is 10 times more the total number of people died in 100 years of belligerency between Israelis and Palestinians. And I can go on and on. In Spain, in France, in most
Yeah,
of the
but you
countries in
see, but
Africa.
I have to play the devil because wherever I go, it's they still tell me, but you are the only one who occupy.
Yeah. So what?
And how come you occupy after your history?
Yeah.
No,
So listen,
no, I have
the
what to answer,
people.
but I all the time challenged, and
Yeah.
I'm challenged until today.
Me too. I'm being challenged as well, and that's fine. We have to
But this is
think. We
but
have to
this
see
is
things.
going back to Israel.
We have look. We're not going to change the political leadership mindset. It's not about one individual.
But I think most Israelis feel the same.
I agree with you. Israelis are ethnocentric to a large degree. They don't connect with the global agenda. For example, the issue of climate change is a non-issue in Israel.
Yeah.
Right.
They
I'm
also don't
talking about
connect that
publicly.
today. It's very on the agenda to deal with minorities.
Yeah,
But I
the
also think
conversation.
that the world is busy with Israel and that this should be the topic, the top thing for everybody else. And it's not.
Right.
Everybody has their
And
own
look, what do
problems.
you expect when you we have in Israel this bereavement culture, tarbut shachol. It's something unique to Israel. It's not Jewish at all, by the way. In Judaism, it's incumbent upon us to celebrate the
Oh,
lives of
really?
those who left us,
I didn't know that.
and not to
The
force
Shiva is a
ourselves
happy moment.
to be. Oh yeah, you're it's incumbent upon the people that visit the shiva to praise the dead and to talk about his or her life and celebrate them. And we are forcing ourselves into a doom and gloom national mood every time something bad happens. It's not Jewish, it's anti-Jewish. And
I don't
so
think most people know it, but
look at the Israeli media every day. Between 5 to 10 stories in the newspapers are about the military.
yes.
Right.
Um, the fact that we listen to the news, we're being forced to listen to the news every hour by the hour. It's insane.
And in
Doesn't
between.
exist,
Yeah.
and in between doesn't exist in any other country. The fact that in Israel, every general that feels like it gives an interview with his or her assessment about Iran, about this, about
Yeah.
Americans don't even know the name of the head of the chiefs of staff. In Israel, the head of the army is a national figure, second only to the president. I mean, there's something terribly and fundamentally wrong about what's happening in Israel. And then
So
add to
how can you
that,
put it aside and
you
then
can't. You can't.
decide to reframe everything and put only the technology,
This is
the
it.
economic
This is
situation,
the solution. You see this?
culture?
This is going to be the solution. It's already happening. What happened? Before 2007, which was the year Steve Jobs introduced the first iPhone, first
Wow,
smartphone,
only 13 years. Unbelievable.
the monopoly to communicate Israel to the world was in the hands of a handful of people. The political leadership, the pundits, all the former ambassadors, the former generals, U.S. officials, and so on. I call them the Tom Friedmans of the world as a metaphor. Tom Friedman was the person that everyone read when he published an
Rachel,
article. I asked my students today, does the name Tom Friedman ring a bell? Just the other day,
They don't.
I have no idea who he is. So what happened was in 2007, this monopoly was taken away from those 500, 600 people that dominated the conversation about Israel and was given to us. We are now the champions of Israel as a brand. We are now communicating Israel to the world. It's the only reason, it's the only explanation to the rise in tourism, to the rise in foreign investment. There is no other explanation because it's certainly not the work of the Israeli government. I can tell you that for sure. Being someone who spent 25 years in government, there's nothing that that I can detect. For example, budget. When we, I'll tell you a story. It's a very sad story. When I worked under Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, she was gracious enough to go to the Minister of Finance because she believed in the program and she supported it wholeheartedly. And she managed to get 20 million shekels budget, which for us was an
A lot.
imaginary budget. You have to understand what is 20 million shekels. It's nothing in terms of if you look at your average retail chain in Israel, how much money they're spending on marketing. But the state of Israel, 20 million shekels, which is $5 million, maybe 6 million. And guess what happened? I received the money for 2 years. I had 2 years to spend the money. My own colleagues, not someone else, my own colleagues in the foreign ministry did everything within their power not to let me spend that money. We ended up spending only 10% of that money, and then the money went for other things. And just a tiny example of how difficult it is. So we're not
But this
going to
is, by the
change.
way, in every field in Israel. That's how
yeah. The
it's
money is
dysfunctional.
designated here, but they go.
And then you have
Right.
elections, and then you
Absolutely.
have different team. It's
Yeah,
terrible.
and of course, I you know, if you ask me, one of the reasons I left the foreign service is because things like that. It really left a very, very bad decision, bad feeling about the organization. I think that diplomatic organizations all over the world are experiencing the same level of confusion. They don't know what to do with the
So they are
technological revolution.
actually against looking at Israel in a different light. They would like to keep the same
Yeah,
narrative
they don't even think about that. They just say,
No,
"Listen,
they
automatically.
want their own way. They don't think about the big picture even. Everybody goes
yeah."
his
Let me
own way.
explain this in simple terms, okay, Tzipi, so that you'll understand the practice of it. So when I joined the Foreign Service, I came from television. I worked for an Israeli newscast called Erev Chadash. I was a big sports fan, and sports was my life, especially basketball. So first thing they tell us in the cadet program is your job, the expectation of you is to be the number one expert on the Middle East. And they gave us a whole bunch of books to read about this and that, and I had to know about the Muslims and this and the Sunnis and the Shiites and the Islamic Brotherhood and Iran and this and Hezbollah. And they said you go to the LA Times, and the first thing you do when you enter the LA Times, you ask to meet with the editorial board, and that seemed very suspicious to me. I said to myself, wait a second, editorial board? When was the last time you read an editorial? Who reads editorials? Nobody reads editorials. And I said, people read the food section, people read the sports section, people read the fashion section, but who reads editorials? So it seemed kind of weird to me. So years later, I'm being told that I have an assignment to go to a town called Peoria, Illinois, to meet with the local paper. And because Caterpillar is based in Peoria, and as you said, there are people saying Caterpillar is selling equipment to the IDF. The IDF is an occupying military. It's illegal, blah, blah, blah. And there were demonstrations. So they forced me basically. I said to them, listen, why should we turn this into a bigger issue than it is? The number one rule in crisis management is don't amplify the very crisis you're trying to contain. But in any event, I go there and I remembered that near Peoria, there's a university called Bradley University where Anthony Parker, who was a big basketball star in Israel, came from. And he was playing for Maccabi Tel Aviv at the time. And I remember that I entered the room, and once I mentioned Anthony Parker, that was it. The conversation was about basketball. They couldn't care less about the demonstrators. And that's just a beautiful example. And it happened to me in my life hundreds of times. I went to see a head of a university here in New York that I couldn't understand why he was declining to see me. It turned out that he was afraid that I will be coming to make another complaint. And when I told him I'm here to discuss collaboration with other universities, he was surprised. And I mean, this is it. This is the meaning of new diplomacy, understanding. And don't get me wrong, there are wonderful people in the Israeli foreign ministry.
Yeah, just
There
the
are
concept
wonderful
is
people.
different. The concept,
It's just that the concept of diplomacy in Israel never prevailed.
yeah. Oi,
Bless you.
bless you, bless
But
you.
it's not only the diplomacy. It's again, I'm going back and back to this attitude because once you're outside of Israel, you see things in a different way. And I think that by accepting what's going on, you just become part of the system, and it's dangerous. And the fact that Israel has to the fact that Israel has to apologize for its existence. And this has nothing to do with the occupation, because I think the occupation is not good. But the existence of Israel, I don't remember any country that is apologizing for its existence. And anybody tells her, maybe you should not be here or just demolish or close the door and lock the door for the country, I think it's wrong. I think that the whole system of the collaboration and working together between the Israelis and outside of Israel, either Israelis or Jews, should be very different. We should be partners for the road and not providers for the road. There are so many things that they're not changing in Israel, and it's like a spread of a bad flu that nobody wants to give up. And doesn't matter how many vaccines.
So, but what will happen
get.
now? What will happen now? That's really, if you
it's
can, what will happen
process.
now that there is a change, let's say, in the US, presidency?
It has nothing to
So-
do with it.
No, the
There are
perception,
good
I mean,
news.
the relationships and how,
There's good
what we
news and there's
expect and what
yeah.
expected from us.
But we're talking
might-
about something else, Tzipi.
Yeah,
there's-
but I just wanted to go a little bit.
there's good
in
news and
respect-
there's bad news. The good news is that governments are becoming less and less central in our lives. The coronavirus is a hiccup, but even coronavirus, the reason why the US government is so dominant is because all the companies that developed the vaccine on this side of the world received the FDA approval. And so it gives the United States a great deal of leverage determining the pace and the distribution of the vaccinations all over the world. But that's the good news. It means that international companies and multinational companies will play a bigger role. When you look today at who's preoccupied with space, not government, it's private companies. Who's preoccupied now with autonomous vehicles, not governments. Things that used to be introduced to as an innovation to the world by governments are now being introduced by private companies. And again, I really believe that COVID-19 is perhaps a turning point because it changes the regulatory environment for approval of new drugs. And we will see major, major advancements.
Ido, do
So
you
that's the good
think
news.
that technology and private sectors will push governments to change ways, or governments will still have to control everything?
I think governments will are going to give them a fight. I think that the fight will be around the issue of revenue from advertisement. That's the only thing. If you look at all the big tech companies as advertising companies, then it means that a different kind of regulation applies. Um, because if they're benefiting from it, if they're making money, they can't say I'm just a platform and the responsibility is on the advertiser. If I'm benefiting from it, then I have to be accountable. And so that's where it's going. And I think
But
Europe
what
is
will
more
be the change
advanced.
towards in the towards Israel, as far as American?
Israel is going to, and that's the bad news. The bad news, so I said the good news is that governments are no longer that important, and we're going to see it. We're going to COVID-19 actually accelerated that process. I know it doesn't look like it. A lot of people talk about nationalism and they confuse nationalism with populism. What
Right.
we're seeing is the rise of populism, not the rise of nationalism, in my mind.
Can you define them?
Regarding Israel, what will happen is very sad. Israel will become less and less relevant, and
Mhm.
Israel will become less and less relevant because of its policies that are so self-centered. They're not connected to the global agenda, and Israelis as individuals will do extremely well as they do now. You find them in academics, you find them in high tech, you find them everywhere you go, and they will do extremely well. And the poor people that will have no option to move upwardly in Israel will stay in Israel,
Right.
and they will continue to live by this self-centered narrative that Tzili so beautifully described as Israel the victim, the victimhood narrative. The late Prime Minister Levi Eshkol said once, he used the term Shimshon der Nebuch, the
Right.
Nebish. We are telling the world two things at the same time, two
Right.
storylines at the same time. In one story, we are victorious and invincible and talented. In the other story, we are poor, we are weak, and we are on the verge of extinction.
Right.
And people that think that those two stories go hand in hand are just making a terrible mistake.
And we're
And
stuck.
yeah, yeah.
And what scares me that Israel will be a state of old people, poor people,
And right wing.
Palestinians, and the ultra Orthodox. But how can we rebrand Israel for the Israelis,
It's the
not
same.
for the
The
outsiders?
brand, yeah, the brand is the same brand for Israelis, for non-Israelis. It's a
But it
celebration
is
of
different because the way we see ourselves in Israel is not the same exactly.
when Israelis will be proud of their nation's creative spirit, it will project to the world outside. So the first thing is to get the Israelis on board. To a large degree, the Israelis are on board. There's a great deal of appreciation and
Sure,
celebration of Israel's achievements in many areas of life, especially in science
absolutely.
and also in technology, in culture. The literary creation, the films coming out of Israel, the music, the design, the art. It's all phenomenal. So that's it's one brand, and the brand is about the creative spirit. When you look at the value proposition, why people are drawn to, let's say, TED Talks, why people listen to TED Talks, because they're looking to be inspired. What inspires them? Creativity. What is the reason people watch, binge on those television series on Amazon Prime and Netflix and HBO and all that? The creativity of the writers. I'm amazed. I'm watching those movies and I say to myself, how this person even thought about this idea? It's amazing, right?
Yeah.
And and so creativity has always been, and our people, as Yuval Noah Harari wrote, excelled in the ability to tell the story of our creativity from one generation to another. And that's really the secret sauce of our existence. And so, on this optimistic note, we can look at the future and say, you know what, we will continue. And you know what, it's not a bad idea for Israel to make less and less noise on the global arena.
Right.
I'd like
Right.
Israel to be a little bit quieter and be normal, because we are far more normal than we think.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. But when you look at the New York Times, by the way, lately I noticed that in the New York Times there are a lot of articles about Israel and not really the positive ones,
Yeah.
even
And
as far as
what's new?
social
What's new?
issues and
Well, again, the
religious.
good news is that the New York Times, just like any other media organization that is editorializing news, is speaking to itself. So don't be impressed by the New York Times, because at
Oh,
the end of
I
the day,
do.
the New York Times is talking to a few million people, and that's about it. The same thing as Fox News and all the other editorialized media organizations. The people that carry the influence are the people that are not predictable. The writers and the institutions that are not predictable are the ones that really have the, for example, the late night shows. They were predictable on Trump, but they're not predictable on any other issue. I listen to them every night. I watch the little videos on YouTube, and I have to say, millions of people are watching them you know, within minutes after they post their YouTube video. It's already, six, 700,000 people watched it. It's insane. I mean, these people have a lot of influence, and they're not predictable. And that's what you need. You need people that do the right thing. You need people that advocate for the right thing, people that are decent, people that have no agenda, that are willing to be
You say
transparent.
decent. Do you think that all the huge, humongous social media companies are decent? Do you think that everything that takes
Well,
place today is decent? It's
you
far
know,
away from decent. It's
well,
scary.
I worked for a large organization, the Israeli government, and Israeli government was accused many times of ill intentions. And I can tell you, I have not met one evil person in my entire years of service who wanted to harm others. I haven't.
Stupidity.
I haven't. Good people work at Facebook. I believe that. I know some of
Yeah.
them. They need to make money. They need to do all sorts of things. They have shareholders. They have their own constraints. And I believe that somewhere they believe they're doing the right thing. This will all be solved when we will be able to verify the source of every piece of information. And once those verification technologies will become standard, then it will eliminate the vast majority of what we call today as fake news, misinformation, and disinformation.
Yeah, but I have one more question which we did touch somehow. But so are you working or thinking about the future of the relationship of Israel with American Jews? I mean, it has to be, it's almost, you have to almost rethink, rethink
Yeah,
what would be
so
the base.
many Israelis of our generation that experienced the Renaissance after the Six Day War
Yeah,
are expecting um, the return of something that never existed. American Jews were never Zionists. The vast majority of them came between 1850 to 1925. Um, 2.3 million people came to North America during that time. A handful of people came to Palestine. And so they never embraced Zionism. It's a myth that we developed in Israel. They never embraced Zionism. A small minority of less than 20% identified with the Zionist movement. So we are yearning for something that never really existed.
wow.
I would say the opposite. Today,
Did you know that?
Zionism has never been more popular in the United States.
Now?
Now, nowadays, Israel has never been more legitimate in the eyes of the world than it is today. Look at Israel's relationships with the biggest players in the world:
Yes.
Russia, China, India, Brazil, and I can go on the list, and
Is it
not to
Bibi?
mention the Arabs. Um,
Is Bibi doing?
it's the creative spirit that attracts them.
So you
Um,
cannot even spoil
what's
this.
the story? What's the story? Why everybody wants to be intimate with Israel? Because they understand that while Israel is a small part of the problem, Israel potentially could be a big part of the solution, whether the problem is climate change or hunger.
Everybody wants to be part of the solution.
Exactly. And they understand that Israel is a big player when it comes to the solution. And so that's the reason why they're all drawn to us. And it has nothing to do with the Israeli foreign policy. Let me just give you one example, and we'll conclude with that. 3 weeks before the US administration announced the peace treaties with the Abraham Accord with the Gulf countries, Israeli government was interested in annexing the Jordan Valley. So, I mean, this was not even on their agenda, just to show you that this was completely an American maneuver. It had nothing to do with Israel. And we should never forget that. We should never forget that. So that's my view for the future. I don't think it's a bad thing for Israel to lay low. You know, when 2003, when we started with the research, and I asked the researcher, a wonderful person, who was for him, it was a project of love. And I said to him, if you had a chance to sit in front of Israeli leaders right now, at the time the prime minister was Ariel Sharon, what would you say? You could say one thing to them. What would that be? And he looked at me and he said, will you shut up already?
It's true.
Wow.
And that's how many of us feel.
Yeah.
Just shut up.
Right.
Just shut up.
Well,
Just do your work. That's
let's see
it.
if they can
Just
do it.
do your work. Exactly.
That's right.
Right.
Ido, thank you. We let
Thank
you
you.
go.
Yeah, it
Thank
was
you.
really, for me, some ideas which I must admit I didn't think about it. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
All
you
right.
for everybody. who
Thank you.
came.
Thank you.
And yeah, and I hope you feel better.
Thank
Bye,
you. Thank
Motek.
you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye. Take care.